My name is Elena Rossi, 45 years old, night shift janitor. My father ran the union at a major construction company in New Jersey. He spent 20 years fighting for workers who had no one else in their corner. When the company finally broke the union, his enemies didn't walk away. Debt collection notices started arriving at our door. Men I had never seen before began showing up outside my apartment building, not doing anything, just standing there, watching. I was Frank Rossi's daughter. That was enough of a reason for them. I had no safe options. I changed my name, found a night shift cleaning job, and stopped being Elena Rossi. Nobody knew who I was. That was the point. 15 years of that. I ended up at Apex Capital on Wall Street, 42nd floor, the executive level. My shift started at midnight and ended at 8 in the morning. I cleaned the offices, emptied the bins, restocked the supply closets. I was there when nobody else was supposed to be there. That was how I knew what I knew. Bradley Vance was the VP of Apex Capital. His office was on my floor. For 3 years, I watched him come in at 4 in the morning, carrying a locked briefcase, use a keycard nobody else used, and leave before the building woke up. I found things in his trash that didn't belong there. I kept them. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with them. I just kept them. Then one morning Bradley decided I had seen too much. That morning in the lobby, I was working in the far corner along the baseboard. I saw him come through the revolving door from across the lobby. I stepped back further into the corner. I kept my head down and kept mopping. Bradley saw me too, from across the lobby. Clearly, he looked right at me. He didn't slow down. He was on his phone, still talking, and he suddenly changed direction and came straight at me at full stride. There was no warning. There was no time to move. In the half second he reached me. The handle of my mop came close to his elbow. That was all that happened. And in that exact moment, the cup in his hand tipped over and emptied down my shoulder. He pulled the phone away from his ear and turned to face me. Every person in that lobby turned with him. "You're the color of the floor, Elena." His voice was almost amused. I almost didn't see a human being there. The coffee soaked through my uniform and burned against my skin. I said nothing. I had not touched him. But there were a dozen people standing in that lobby, and none of them could have known that. That was exactly what he needed. Witnesses. My mop in my hands. His coffee on the floor. That combination was enough. 2 hours later, Bradley submitted a formal complaint to our. His statement said the janitor had deliberately approached him on multiple occasions and made physical contact. It said she had been verbally warned and had not stopped. It listed the names of 3 people who had been standing in the lobby that morning. I had not said one word to Bradley Vance that morning. I had not looked at his face before he changed direction and walked toward me. None of that was in his statement. Our called me at 2 in the afternoon. "Ms. Rossi, you're terminated, effective immediately." "On what grounds?" "Harassment of an executive." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." His word against a janitor's. No investigation. No hearing. Done in one phone call. What Bradley actually wanted was not my job. He wanted me out of that building before I did anything with 3 years of what I had been collecting. That night I sat at my kitchen table and opened my bank account on my phone. $42.10. My father's Alzheimer's medication cost $430 for a 30-day supply. Medicare had just rejected the coverage application. I was looking at a number that didn't come close. Then a news alert came through. Apex Capital analyst Daniel Miller, 28 years old, arrested that morning on federal charges of embezzling $50 million in client retirement funds. I read it twice. I knew Daniel. He was the young man who stayed at his desk alone every night long after everyone else had gone home. I had emptied his trash can 3 nights a week for 3 years. I knew what was in it. Student loan repayment notices, $80,000 in FOFSA debt, overdue credit card statements, a home equity line of credit approval for $47,000, which meant he had already used up every other option he had. He was 28 years old and he was drowning. He couldn't afford to lose his job. He signed off on whatever his supervisor put in front of him without reading it carefully. Because reading it carefully and finding a problem meant he might lose his job. Bradley knew all of that. That was the reason he chose Daniel specifically. For 3 years, Bradley had been using Daniel's employee login and password to access the firm's pension management system after hours. He processed transfer approvals under Daniel's name. He opened internal accounts under Daniel's credentials. Every transaction in the Ghost account network had Daniel's employee ID attached to it as the authorizing analyst. Daniel had been sitting at his desk for 3 years with no idea that his name was being used to move millions of dollars out of client retirement accounts. And now every dollar of it was sitting on Daniel's record, not Bradley's. I set the phone face down on the table and sat in the dark for a while. $42. Daniel in a federal holding cell. My father in his apartment in Newark, not recognizing my face on most days. I opened the kitchen drawer. At the back, under the takeout menus and the spare keys, was my father's union pin. He had worn it every day for 20 years. A small brass circle with a handshake on the front and the words Rossi Local Stand and Deliver along the bottom edge. The brass had gone dark with age, but the edge was still sharp. His voice came back to me, not a memory exactly, more like something that had been waiting. Knowledge, Elena, that's the one thing they can never take from you. The job gone, the money gone, the title gone, but what you know stays yours. I thought about the kitchen drawer. Behind the pin, in a sealed envelope, were the things I had been quietly setting aside for 3 years. Penalty notices pulled from Bradley's personal trash. Early withdrawal documents from client retirement accounts, with account holder names that were not Bradley's. Shredded ledger fragments I had pieced back together page by page on a light table at a 24-hour copy shop. Ghost account numbers, transfer amounts, Daniel's employee ID on every authorization line. And a note I had written after a conversation in the parking garage with Roy, the overnight car service driver who had been taking Bradley to a private residential address in Greenwich, Connecticut, 4 times in the past 6 months and who had, on one of those trips, left Bradley's cloud storage open on the vehicle tablet long enough to see a folder labeled KV Correspondence. Bradley had thrown all of it away, every piece of it, into bins on a floor cleaned by a woman whose name he didn't know. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. I took the pin out of the drawer and held it in my hand for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Roy, the overnight driver. Tell me everything you have on Bradley Vance. A pause. Then, I figured someone would call eventually. The vacuum cleaner had a particular sound at 300 a.m. Not the aggressive roar it made during the day when the maintenance crew ran it through the lobby in overlapping passes, competing with ringing phones and elevator chimes. No, at this hour, the machine settled into something almost meditative. A low, even hum that filled the corridors of Apex Capital the way a heartbeat fills a chest. Steady, invisible, necessary. Elena Rossi moved through the 42nd floor. The way water moves through a pipe following the path of least resistance, present everywhere, noticed by no one. She had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of buffing the same mahogany baseboards, of replacing the same scented hand soap in the executive washrooms, of emptying the same crystal wastebaskets that cost more than her monthly rent. She knew the building's rhythms the way a doctor knows a patient's breathing, the overnight security rotation. The exact moment the HVAC system shifted gears, the particular creak of the elevator when it stopped on the 39th floor. She knew things about this building that the people who owned it would never know. She knew, for instance, that the Keurig in the executive break room had a slow drip behind the heating element that nobody had bothered to fix. She knew that the third stall in the men's room on the executive floor had a lock that didn't quite catch. She knew that Bradley Vance, vice president of Apex Capital, left his personal trash can slightly pulled away from his desk on the nights he worked late, a small habit, perhaps unconscious, as if the physical distance made the disposal feel less deliberate. But Elena Rossi kept these things to herself. Keeping things to herself was something she had perfected over 15 years of careful living. She guided the vacuum along the east corridor, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the Manhattan skyline into an oil painting. All orange and black, and the cold blue of the Hudson in the distance. Out there, the city hummed at its own register, the deep bass of a world that ran on money and momentum. In here, the only sound was her machine and the occasional click of the building settling against the October wind. She turned off the vacuum when she reached the supply closet. It was barely large enough to turn around in. A narrow room smelling of industrial cleaner and synthetic lemon. Shelves stacked with replacement rolls and cleaning solutions in institutional sizes. Elena sat on an overturned mop bucket and pulled the envelope from the front pocket of her uniform. She'd been carrying it since yesterday. She already knew what it said. She'd read it 4 times in the hallway outside her apartment building. Standing under the flickering security light, reading the same paragraph over and over the way you reread something when your brain refuses to absorb it. We regret to inform you that the following Medicare claim has been denied due to insufficient medical necessity documentation. The requested treatment, Aduhelm infusion therapy for Alzheimer's disease, falls outside current coverage parameters. Her father's name was printed at the top. Frank Rossi, apartment 4B, Newark, New Jersey. Frank Rossi, who had once shut down 3 construction sites in 48 hours with nothing but a phone and a principal. Frank Rossi, who had negotiated pension protections for 11,000 workers in 1994 while the company lawyers sent threats to his house. Frank Rossi, who now sat in a recliner in a small apartment and sometimes didn't recognize the woman who came to visit on Sunday afternoons. Elena folded the letter along its existing creases and tucked it back into her pocket. She allowed herself 30 seconds. She counted them. Then she stood up, opened the supply closet door, and stepped back into the corridor. She had floors to finish. It was on her second pass of the executive suites, just past 4 in the morning, that she heard the elevator. She paused. The machine idled in her hands. The building's overnight schedule was something she knew as well as her own habits. And there was no one who should be arriving at this hour, not the security guards, who made their rounds on foot, not the cleaning crew, all of whom were working other sections of the building. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor with a soft chime. Bradley Vance stepped out. He was dressed in what she recognized as his weekend clothes: dark slacks, a collared shirt open at the throat, and he carried the briefcase. She had seen it before, once or twice, but never thought much of it. A soft leather attaché, expensive looking, the kind that closed with a combination lock rather than a clasp. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't talking. He moved through the corridor with a focused, deliberate quietness that didn't match the man she watched every morning, the one who walked the lobby like he was performing for an audience. Loud voice, wide gestures, a man who filled every room he entered. This version of Bradley Vance was smaller somehow, more careful. Elena had already pressed herself into the alcove beside the window office, the vacuum's power cord looped around one hand. She stood still, breath shallow. He didn't look in her direction. He went directly to his office, used a keycard she'd never seen him use during business hours, a secondary access card, matte black, and let himself in. The door clicked shut behind him. Elena counted to 60 before she moved. She told herself she was simply resuming her route. She told herself she was circling back to collect the bag from the East Wing wastebaskets, which she'd skipped in her first pass. She told herself that whatever Bradley Vance did in his office at 4 in the morning was entirely his business. And that a woman who had survived 15 years of careful anonymity had not done so by asking questions. She collected the wastebaskets. She worked methodically, moving from office to office along the south wall, exchanging liners, replacing the bags with quick, practiced efficiency. When she reached Bradley's office, the door was still closed. The personal waste bin he kept beside his credenza, the small leather-trimmed one he used for paper. rather than the larger receptacle near his desk had been pushed into the corridor. He did that sometimes, slid it out during his late evenings so the cleaning crew wouldn't need to enter. She lifted the liner. There were the usual things: a coffee sleeve, a takeout receipt, a shredded subscription renewal for a publication she didn't recognize. And beneath these, crumpled into a rough sphere as if discarded in a hurry, a single sheet of paper. She wouldn't have looked at it twice if the letterhead hadn't caught the light a certain way. Apex Capital Client Services Penalty Disclosure Notice. Her fingers didn't move for 3 full seconds. She smoothed the paper against her thigh, just enough to read the lines that weren't creased beyond legibility. It was a standard 401k early withdrawal penalty notice, the kind sent to account holders who'd pulled funds before retirement age. The kind that came with a heavy tax consequence and a 10% penalty attached. The name on the account wasn't Bradley Vance. It was a name she didn't recognize. An older man's name, an account holder who apparently had no idea that a withdrawal had been initiated in his name. I'm just the air they breathe out, she thought. That's what she'd told herself, all the times she'd needed to keep moving. You become invisible enough, eventually you believe it yourself. She pressed the notice flat, folded it carefully along the lines of its original creasing, and slid it beneath the fresh liner at the bottom of her cleaning cart. Between the layer of industrial paper towels and the shelf that held her extra bags. Her hands were shaking. She noticed the shaking the way you notice your own heartbeat in a quiet room only because the silence made it audible. She pressed her palms flat against the cart's handle and held still until the trembling passed. It was nearly 5 when she reached the far end of the corridor where the junior analysts worked. The offices here were smaller, the furniture newer and cheaper, the city view blocked by the neighboring building's mechanical floor. Most of the desks were dark, but one of them glowed. Daniel Miller was still at his computer. He was 28 years old, and at this hour he looked younger or perhaps older, it was hard to say. The fluorescent light made the shadows under his eyes deeper. He had his jacket draped over the back of his chair, and his sleeves rolled up, and spread across the corner of his desk was a stack of papers that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. Elena could read a desk the way other people read faces. Those weren't work documents. They were bills, reminders, the specific geometry of financial pressure that she had learned to recognize at a distance. She didn't look long. She moved the vacuum past his doorway with careful quiet, the way she always did when someone was still working. She was a professional courtesy without a title, but as she passed, she glanced once more at the pile on his desk. And at the pale, concentrated expression on his face, the way his jaw was tight. The way he was calculating something that had nothing to do with client assets. Is this how it starts? She didn't know where the thought came from, only that it arrived fully formed, cold and certain, the way certain kinds of knowledge arrive. Another good man sitting under fluorescent lights, trying to outrun a number that gets bigger no matter how fast he runs. She didn't stop. She didn't speak to him. She pushed the cart around the corner, back toward the supply closet, and in the still, hissing quiet of the building's mechanical systems. She heard her own breathing, unsteady now, deliberate. The city outside was beginning to pale at the edges, the first gray suggestion of morning pressing against the glass. Elena Rossi rolled her cart into position, checked the contents of her bins, and made sure the crumpled notice was still where she'd put it. Then she went back to work. The break room on the 42nd floor smelled like it always did at this hour, burnt coffee from the pot that someone had left on since yesterday afternoon. And beneath that, the sharp chemical undertone of the industrial bleach she'd used on the floor tiles 2 nights ago. The combination had become so familiar to Elena that she barely registered it anymore. It was simply the smell of this particular room at this particular hour. The way certain places develop a scent that belongs only to them. She refilled the paper towel dispenser above the sink, and wiped down the counter with the kind of automatic efficiency that left her mind free to move elsewhere. It had been 4 days since she found the withdrawal notice. She had looked at it 7 times. Not obsessively, she was too careful for obsession, but deliberately, The way you return to a photograph trying to identify something you can't quite name. She'd smoothed it against her kitchen table at 2 in the morning and studied the account number, the client ID, the specific language of the penalty disclosure. She knew enough about financial documents from her father's union years to understand what she was reading. Someone had initiated an early withdrawal from a retirement account that didn't belong to them. The account holder was 67 years old. The withdrawal amount was $34,000. The penalty notice had been sent to a P.O. box that almost certainly wasn't the account holder's actual address. She'd folded it again and put it back in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus and the spare keys. She was on her second pass of the break room when Daniel Miller came in. He moved with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for too long trying to convince themselves they weren't tired. His tie was loosened, his hair pushed back from his forehead in the distracted way of someone who had run his hands through it many times. He went directly to the coffee machine, poured a cup, and then stood at the counter drinking it in a way that had nothing to do with enjoyment. Elena continued wiping the far end of the counter. She was, as usual, invisible. He set his coffee down and reached into his laptop bag, pulling out a thick envelope. He set it on the table beside his cup and stared at it the way people stare at things they've already read too many times. Not to absorb new information, but because looking away feels like surrender. The return address read Federal Student Aid Office of Loan Servicers. She kept her eyes on the counter. But she had already seen it. He pulled out his phone and set it face up beside the envelope. A notification sat on the screen. The preview text visible even from where she stood: FOFSA repayment reminder, amount due $1,847, due date November 1st. He picked up his coffee again, set it down without drinking, pressed the heels of both hands against the table edge. Elena moved to the next section of counter. The squeegee made a soft sound against the laminate. "Sorry," Daniel said suddenly. "I didn't sorry. I'll get out of your way." "You're fine," she said. It was the most she'd said to anyone on this floor in a week. He looked at her, then actually looked. The way people occasionally did when she spoke and reminded them she was a person. He had a young face that the fluorescent light was doing no favors, the kind of face that would be open and easy under better circumstances. "You're here every night," he said. Not accusatory, just noticing. "Most nights," she said. He nodded, looked back at the envelope. Do you ever get used to it? The hours, I mean. You get used to being tired," she said. "That's not the same thing." He almost smiled. Then his phone buzzed again and the almost smile was gone. She finished the counter section and moved her card toward the door. As she passed the table, she glanced just once at the HELOC document that had slipped halfway out of the envelope beside the student loan notice. A home equity line of credit application, already approved, for $47,000. The kind of financial move that meant someone had run out of other options. Is this how it starts? The thought arrived again, the same as it had 4 days ago. Another good man, being methodically hollowed out by someone in a better suit. She didn't say anything. She pushed her card into the corridor and continued her route. It was 3 nights later that she found the ledger fragments. The high-security shredding bin on the 42nd floor was a different grade from the standard recycling, a cross-cut model, industrial. The kind that produced confetti rather than strips. Most of what went into it came out unreadable. That was the point. But the bin had been overfilled. Someone had pushed documents in past capacity, and the cutting mechanism had partially jammed, leaving a layer of material at the top that was shredded in strips rather than the fine cross pattern the machine was designed to produce. Long, readable strips, in some cases. 4 to 6 words per fragment. Sometimes more. Elena's job was to empty the bin into a sealed disposal bag. She did this methodically, transferring the contents section by section. And she was careful, as she always was, not to look at what she was handling. But a fragment caught against the back of her glove, and when she peeled it free, the words on it stopped her hand in midair. Ghost ACCT Miller, D. Auth ID. She stood very still. She set the fragment on the floor beside her cart, reached back into the bin, worked carefully, the way you work when you understand that speed is the enemy of accuracy. In the next 10 minutes, she collected 11 fragments that, laid side by side on the floor of the supply closet with the door closed, formed the partial outline of an internal ledger. The entries were incomplete, names redacted in some places, account numbers truncated, but the structure was recognizable. Column headers, authorization codes, transfer amounts, and in 2 separate fragments, legible and unambiguous: Miller, D. Auth. Level 2 transfer authorized. Transfer amounts she could only partially reconstruct, but the column they occupied was labeled, in clear black type: Ghost Account Series Client Fund Reallocation. Elena sat on the upturned mop bucket in the supply closet and thought about what she was looking at. Daniel Miller's employee ID was being used to authorize transfers from client retirement accounts into accounts that didn't belong to any client. Daniel Miller, who was 28 years old and $80,000 in debt and working late every night trying to keep his head above a waterline that kept rising. Daniel Miller, who almost certainly had no idea his access credentials were being used for anything at all. She thought about the secondary keycard, the briefcase with the combination lock, the withdrawal notice with the wrong name on it. She thought about Bradley Vance, moving through the building at 4 in the morning with the careful quiet of a man disposing of something. Is this how it starts? It wasn't a question anymore. She saw Daniel the next evening in the corridor outside the analyst section. He was on the phone, and she caught only the tail end of what he was saying. As she passed something about a system flag, something about a reconciliation error in the pension records. His voice had the careful, slightly elevated tone of someone describing a problem they don't fully understand to someone they don't entirely trust. She paused outside his office door. She wanted to say something. She had rehearsed 3 different versions of a warning in the quiet of her apartment. All of them vague enough to be deniable, specific enough to prompt caution. Be careful with your login credentials. Someone's been in the system. Don't let your access be used for anything you haven't personally reviewed. He ended the call and looked up, saw her in the doorway. Hey, he said. He looked tired in a new way, a worried tired, different from the exhausted but managing tired of a week ago. System giving you trouble? She asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. Pension reconciliations showing transfers I don't remember running. Probably just a glitch. He said it the way people say probably just when they're hoping saying it out loud will make it true. She opened her mouth. His phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at it, and the expression on his face shifted. The notification preview was another FOFSA reminder. The amount larger this time, the due date closer. He picked up the phone. Sorry, I have to take this. She stepped back from the doorway and moved on down the corridor. Another good man destroyed by a man in a suit. She gripped the cart handle and kept moving. The morning rush at Apex Capital arrived like a tide. Elena had learned to time her work around it to have the lobby floors finished before 7:45, when the first wave of associates came through the revolving doors, trailing briefcases and cold air to be working the far corridors by 8:15, when the managing directors arrived. And the energy of the building shifted from ambient to pressurized. By 9, the 42nd floor was a different organism entirely. Phones ringing, printers cycling, the particular aggressive cheer of men performing confidence at each other across open office space. She was supposed to be done by 8, but the East Lobby mop line had taken longer than usual, a spilled protein drink near the security desk. The kind of thick, sweetened mess that required 2 passes, and she was still finishing the main lobby floor at 7:52 when Bradley Vance came through the revolving door. She had positioned herself near the far wall, working a section of tile that put the reception desk between her cart and the main foot traffic path. She was not in the way. She was, as she always was at this hour, simply part of the building's infrastructure. As relevant to the arriving executives as the ventilation registers or the emergency exit signs. Bradley Vance was on the phone. He came through the lobby the way he always did, with the particular stride of a man who had never once considered whether there was enough room for him. Not because he was careless, but because the question had simply never occurred to him. He was dressed in a charcoal suit with a faint chalk stripe, a tie in deep burgundy, cufflinks catching the lobby light. His voice filled the space in front of him like a wake. Country Club Committee is being ridiculous. The pavilion renovation was budgeted at 4, not 3.5. Tell them that comes from me personally. No, I don't want to hear about the walk concerns, Richard, I really don't. Elena pressed toward the wall, tightening her path. Her mop moved in its practiced ellipses, working the grout lines. She didn't look up. She never looked up. Bradley Vance walked past her with the phone still at his ear. And without breaking his stride, without a pause in the conversation, without a single glance in her direction, he tilted his coffee cup. The cup was from the cafe 2 blocks down, the large size, still hot enough to steam in the cold lobby air. He tilted it as he passed, a slight, almost negligent rotation of the wrist, and the lid, not properly seated, or perhaps deliberately loosened, gave way. The liquid came down across Elena's left shoulder in a single, scalding sheet. She didn't cry out. The sound that escaped her was involuntary and small, a sharp intake of breath, a bitten-off noise in the back of her throat. The heat soaked through her uniform immediately, through the thin cotton of the undershirt beneath, against the skin of her shoulder and upper arm. It was the particular, insistent burn of something that had been very hot a moment ago and was now simply transferring that heat as directly as possible. She stood still. Look, just tell the committee that the Vance family has been members since 1987, that ought to settle it. Bradley Vance walked on. He had not stopped. He had not looked back. The cup, now mostly empty, was still in his hand as he rounded the corner toward the elevator bank. He was still talking. Elena looked down at her sleeve. The brown stain spread from her shoulder to just above her elbow, darker at the center, paling to a diluted ring at the edges. A drip ran down to her wrist and fell onto the marble she had polished 40 minutes ago. She was aware that there were 2 associates who had witnessed this. She could see them in her peripheral vision, near the security desk, both young, both in their first years here by the look of them, both holding their coffee cups and looking at the floor with the careful, studied blankness of people who had decided, very quickly, not to have seen anything. The reception desk attendant, a woman named Paula, who had worked this desk for 11 years and knew Elena by her schedule. If not her name, had turned to face her computer screen. Elena set her mop against the cart. She walked to the supply closet near the service corridor, opened it, and stood inside with the door pulled almost closed. The smell of bleach and lemon and warm plastic. She pressed the back of her hand against the shoulder of her uniform. The fabric was saturated. The burn had settled into a steady, radiating ache. She stood there for 2 minutes. Precisely 2. She was counting because counting was the only thing keeping the thing building behind her sternum from becoming something she couldn't take back. When she came out, she returned to the lobby, picked up her mop, and finished the floor. She didn't see Bradley Vance again until 10 past 8, when she was collecting the corridor bins near the executive suite. He had finished his call. He was standing outside his office door talking to another VP. She recognized the man vaguely, someone from the risk management floor, and his voice had resumed its natural register, expansive and certain. The coffee was gone. The morning was progressing exactly as mornings progressed for men like Bradley Vance. As she rounded the corridor bend with her cart, he glanced in her direction. "You're still here?" he said. Not to her specifically, to the air around her. "Maintenance should have this floor clear by 8. There are client meetings starting." "I'll be done in 10 minutes, she said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised, somewhere underneath everything, at how level it came out. He looked at her, then a longer look than the lobby, a look with something in it she recognized. Not recognition, assessment, the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they're considering moving. "See that you are," he said, and turned back to his conversation. Elena moved past him. The cart's wheel caught briefly on the carpet seam outside his office, and as she righted it, Her gaze dropped just for a second to the floor beside his left foot. He had a document folder tucked under his arm, the thick kind used for contract packets. But one sheet had slipped partway out, face down, the reverse side visible. She could see the watermark of a legal services firm. She recognized a firm that specialized in real estate and mortgage instruments. And below the watermark, in the upside-down orientation visible from her angle, the bolded header of a reverse mortgage disclosure statement. She kept walking, but in the supply closet, 5 minutes later, she stood very still with both hands flat on the shelf and thought about what she'd been accumulating. A 401k withdrawal penalty notice. A name that wasn't Bradley's. A partial ledger with Daniel Miller's authorization codes. A secondary keycard for after-hours access. A briefcase with a combination lock. A reverse mortgage disclosure for an account that was certainly not Bradley Vance's. She thought about the age on the withdrawal notice. 67. She thought about the specific dollar amount. $34,000. She thought about what a man like Bradley Vance needed $34,000 for badly enough to steal it from a 67-year-old's retirement account, when, by all visible indications, he earned more than that in a single month. Country club renovation, real estate instruments, offshore account structures she was only beginning to understand the shape of. He's not just stealing, she thought. He's covering something. Something that costs more than the stealing. Her shoulders still burned. She pressed her palm against it through the fabric. And Daniel is the name on the ledger. She found the second document fragment that same night. She had taken to working the high-security bin more carefully than the job strictly required. She did it slowly, methodically, handling the shredded material the way an archaeologist handles excavated fragments, not rushing. Not forcing, simply allowing the pieces to reveal what they revealed. This fragment was from a different kind of document. Not a ledger, a memo, internal, with a header she could only partially reconstruct. But 3 consecutive strips had come through the jam in readable condition, and laid side by side on the supply closet floor. They formed a sentence that was complete enough. Authorization credentials Miller, D. Confirmed for Series 7 transfers per VP directive. Per VP directive. Not a system error. Not a glitch in the pension reconciliation. Not something Daniel Miller had done or authorized or was even aware of. A directive. Elena sat on the mop bucket for a long time. The building hummed around her. The city outside was doing what it always did, moving, accumulating, spending, losing, and in a supply closet on the 42nd floor. A janitor in a coffee-stained uniform was beginning to understand that she was not simply a witness to something. She was the only person who could see it. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father's voice, the particular timbre of it in 1998. When he'd stood in front of 1,100 workers outside a midtown construction site and said, "Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you. Everything else, the job, the wages, the title, they can take all of that. But not what you know." She opened her eyes. She put the fragments in the same kitchen drawer as the withdrawal notice. Then she went back to finish the floor. The termination notice was on her kitchen table when she got home. She saw it the moment she opened the apartment door, a single white envelope, delivered by hand. Judging by the absence of postal markings, propped against the salt shaker in the center of the table. Her super had a key. She'd given it to him 2 years ago for emergencies. She had not considered, at the time, that emergencies came in this particular shape. The return address was Apex Capital Human Resources. The letter inside was 3 paragraphs. She read it standing at the table in her coat, her cleaning bag still on her shoulder. The language was formal and thoroughly sanitized. Conduct unbecoming a vendor employee. Harassment of an executive. Failure to maintain professional boundaries consistent with vendor contract obligations. The effective date was listed as 2 days prior, backdated, which meant the paperwork had been in process for at least a week before she found it. Bradley Vance had filed the complaint. His name appeared in the second paragraph in the neutral, passive construction that HR departments favored following a formal complaint submitted by VP Bradley Vance. She set the letter down. She sat in the kitchen chair closest to the window, the one where the radiator's warmth reached best, and she looked at the table. The salt shaker, the letter, the stack of utility bills she'd been managing on a week-by-week basis. The small framed photograph of her father from 1997, standing in front of a construction site gate with 3 other union men. All of them grinning with the particular satisfaction of people who have just won something important. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. She picked it up without thinking. The reflexive gesture of someone checking the time. The headline was 4 words long. Analyst arrested in $50 million fraud. The article loaded slowly on her phone screen, the data connection struggling. But the name in the first paragraph was immediate and clear. Daniel Miller, 28, a junior analyst at Apex Capital, was arrested this morning on charges of securities fraud and embezzlement, totaling approximately $50 million in client retirement funds. Miller allegedly used his authorized access to the firm's pension management system too. She stopped reading. She set the phone face down on the table. The radiator clicked and hissed in the corner. Outside, the street sounds of her New Jersey block filtered through the window, a bus pulling away from the stop, someone's dog. The particular rattle of the corner bodega's security gate being lowered for the night. Daniel Miller had been awake at 3 in the morning trying to calculate his student loan payments. Daniel Miller had HELOC paperwork spread across his desk because he had already exhausted every other option. Daniel Miller had told her about a system glitch in the pension records, with the specific bewildered tone of someone describing something they genuinely didn't understand. And Daniel Miller's authorization codes were on a ledger fragment in her kitchen drawer that said per VP directive. She pressed her palms flat against the tabletop. The cold of the laminate surface traveled up through her hands. She got up and went to the bathroom. She had showered twice since the morning, once when she'd come home after the incident, once before attempting to sleep in the afternoon. But the smell of the coffee was still there, or she believed it was still there, which amounted to the same thing. She stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at the reddened patch on her shoulder where the burn had settled into a bruise adjacent flush against the skin. "You're the color of the floor, Elena. I almost didn't see a human being there." She had not let herself fully hear those words until now. She had packed them away in the same place she packed the other things. The things she'd been packing away for 15 years, since the day she'd changed her name and taken the night shift and decided that invisibility was a kind of armor. She thought about what it had cost her. The name, the history, the work her father had done, not just the union, not just the negotiations, but the specific, principled, exhausting work of fighting for people who had no other champion. She had abandoned all of it to become someone who cleaned floors in buildings where men like Bradley Vance poured hot coffee on women like her and kept walking. She went back to the kitchen. She opened the drawer. She took out the withdrawal notice and the ledger fragments and laid them on the table in the order she'd found them. She looked at them the way she should have looked at them from the beginning, not as evidence of something too large to touch, but as information. The only thing they can't take from you. Her phone was still face down on the table. She turned it over. She checked her bank account. $42.10. Her father's medication, the one the Medicare rejection had refused to cover, cost $430 for a 30-day supply. She set the phone down again. She reached into the back of the kitchen drawer, past the takeout menus, past the spare keys, past the accumulated paper. Debris of a life lived carefully and quietly, and her fingers found something cold and small. She hadn't looked at it in over a year. She pulled it out and held it in the light from the kitchen window. Her father's union pin, brass, or something that had once been brass, the surface darkened to a deep amber brown with age, the edge worn smooth in most places. But the face was still clear. The design was simple, a clasped handshake inside a circle, and below it, the words Rossi Local Stand and Deliver. The edge, she noticed, was still sharp. She closed her fingers around it. "I thought I could hide," she admitted to herself. Not in the way she'd been admitting things, carefully, partially, always with an escape route. Fully this time, in the cold quiet of her kitchen with $42 in her account and a termination notice on the table. I thought if I stayed small enough, kept my head down, didn't ask questions, didn't take up space, I thought that was safety. I thought that was smart. She opened her hand and looked at the pin again. But he stepped on me anyway. She sat at the table for a long time after that, not paralyzed, something closer to the stillness that precedes decision. The particular quiet of a person who has finished one kind of thinking and is beginning another. When she finally moved, she got up, put the kettle on, and spread everything she had on the table. The withdrawal notice, the ledger fragments, the termination letter. She read each one again, slowly, all the way through. Then she got a notepad from the drawer and began to write. Friends, what a journey we've taken so far. Elena thought she could disappear. 15 years of careful invisibility, a false name, a night shift life where no one asked questions. But some men find a way to step on you regardless. We've watched her collect the pieces, the withdrawal notice, the shredded ledger, Daniel's name on someone else's crime, all of it stacking up in a kitchen drawer. While her bank account reads $42.10. And now the man who poured coffee on her like she was furniture has taken her job. And framed an innocent young man in the process. But here's what Bradley Vance doesn't know. He looked right at her and saw a janitor. He never once considered what she might have seen. Stay with us because the night shift isn't over yet. She was 7 years old the first time she saw her father stand his ground. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that specifically Tuesday, because she'd had a spelling test that morning. And she was thinking about the word necessary as she sat in the back seat of her father's pickup on the way to the construction site where he needed to check in with the crew foreman. But when they arrived, there were men outside the gate. Not union men, different men, in different clothes, with the particular stillness of people who were waiting for something they'd been hired to wait for. Her father had told her to stay in the truck. She had watched through the windshield as he got out, walked to the gate, and spoke to the men. She couldn't hear what was said. What she could see was her father's posture, unhurried, fully planted, the way a tree is planted, weight distributed. No part of him braced for anything because no part of him was afraid. He spoke. The other men spoke. One of them stepped forward. Her father reached into his jacket pocket and placed something in the man's hand. He said something else, and then the men left. She'd asked him about it afterward, sitting in a diner booth over grilled cheese. What did you give them? A ledger page, he'd said. Just one. A copy. What was on it? He'd looked at her with the specific expression he reserved for things he considered important, fully attentive. Treating the question with the seriousness it deserved. Names, he said. Just names. But the right names. And that made them leave? Knowledge, he said, is the only thing they can't take from you. Everything else, the job, the money, the title, they can strip all of that. But not what you know. And not what you can prove. Now, sitting at her kitchen table in the November dark of a New Jersey apartment, Elena Rossi thought about that diner booth for the first time in years. She thought about the ledger page her father had given those men. A copy, he'd said. Not the original. You keep the original. She looked at the fragments spread across her table. Partial, incomplete, enough to understand the shape of the crime, but not enough not yet to prove it. She needed the original, or something better than fragments. She thought about the structure of what Bradley had built, the ghost accounts, the junior analyst credentials used as a firewall, the offshore logs she'd glimpsed in partial form on the shredded documents. It was elegant, in the particular way that financial crimes were elegant, designed to look like someone else's mistake when it unraveled. And it had unraveled exactly the way he'd designed it to. Daniel Miller was in custody. Bradley Vance was preparing for another country club weekend. But Bradley had a problem that elegant men always had. He had underestimated the infrastructure around him. Not the analysts, not the associates, not anyone with a badge and a business card and a desk on the 42nd floor. The people nobody looked at. Elena picked up the phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't called in over 2 years. A man named Roy, who drove the overnight executive car service. who had driven Bradley Vance to a private address in Connecticut on 4 separate occasions in the past 6 months, and who had mentioned this once, just once, casually, the way people mention things they don't know, are significant to Elena in the parking structure when she was waiting for the late shuttle. She stared at Roy's number. The invisible people, she thought. The ones who hear everything because nobody thinks they're listening. Her father had known this. He had built his entire operation on this principle. The notion that the people who move through spaces without authority are often moving through them with more information than anyone who holds a title. Drivers, janitors, security guards, the people who empty the bins and refill the coffee and stand outside the door while the meeting happens inside. She thought about Bradley's briefcase, the combination lock, the after-hours keycard. She thought about the fact that in 3 years of working the 42nd floor, she had learned the building systems more thoroughly than most of the people who worked in it during daylight hours. Tonight, she thought, the janitor finishes the job. She looked at the Apex Capitol Tower through her apartment window. 42 floors of glass and steel, lit from within, the Manhattan skyline. Visible beyond it all that accumulated power and money and certainty, reflected back against itself. She picked up the pen. She began to make a list. The Kinko's on West 34th was open 24 hours and asked no questions. Elena arrived at 11:15 with a canvas tote bag that held, among other things, a collection of shredded document fragments in labeled Ziploc bags, a legal pad covered in her own notes, a box of latex gloves she'd purchased at a drugstore 3 blocks away, and her father's union pin, tucked into the front pocket of her jacket where she could feel it against her ribs when she moved. She took a table in the back corner, away from the 2 college students doing poster work near the front window and the overnight business traveler printing boarding passes near the door. She put on the gloves. She laid out the fragments. She had been doing this in her apartment for days, the painstaking work of fragment matching, identifying common paperweights, aligning shred lines, constructing partial documents from confetti. She had made progress, but there was a limit to what she could do under a 40-watt kitchen bulb with tired eyes and no tools beyond her own patience. The Kinko's had a light table. She worked for 2 hours. The light table let her see through the fragments, match fiber patterns, identify which pieces had originally been part of the same sheet. By 1 in the morning, she had reconstructed 7 documents to 60% legibility or better. By 1:30, she had something she could work with. The ghost account structure was clearer than she'd understood. Not one shadow account, a network. 7 accounts, each in a different name, each authorized through a different junior analyst's credential. The authorizations rotated on a quarterly schedule, so no single employee's access showed a pattern that would trigger compliance review. The transfers were modest in isolation, between $30,000 and $85,000 per transaction, but the network had been running for at least 3 years. And the aggregate figure, reconstructed from the partial ledger columns, was somewhere north of $4 million. Not $50 million. That number, the number attached to Daniel's arrest, was not in these documents at all. She wrote that down in large letters on her notepad: $4 million, not $50 million. Daniel's number is fabricated. She photographed everything with her phone. Fragments and reconstructions both. Roy was not surprised to hear from her. This was itself a kind of information. When she called him at 2 in the morning and said she needed to talk, he'd been quiet for only a moment before saying, "I figured someone would call eventually. Thought it'd be the feds." They met in the parking structure of Roy's building in Astoria at 3:15. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with the patient, observational stillness of someone who had spent 30 years driving other people through the city and listening to what they said while they forgot he was there. He hadn't forgotten anything. He gave her dates: 4 trips to a private address in Greenwich, Connecticut, a residential property, not an office, registered to a holding company. He gave her the name on the mailbox, which he'd photographed once out of habit and professional curiosity. He gave her the time of day of each trip and the approximate duration of each visit. He told her about the 2 phone calls he'd overheard on the longer trips, not the specific words, but enough of the tone and context to understand that Bradley Vance was managing something that required in-person contact with someone he didn't trust to communicate with digitally. "There's one more thing," Roy said, before she left. He pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot. He uses the car service app. 3 months ago, he left himself logged into the company tablet, the one in the vehicle when he got out. "I don't go looking for things." He met her eyes clearly. "But the app had his shared cloud storage linked. And I saw a folder name before I logged him out." The screenshot showed a cloud storage directory. One folder was labeled BV Personal Do Not Sync. Below it, a subfolder KV Correspondence. "KV," she said. "I looked it up later," Roy said. "Took me a while." "KV, that's a firm. Cullinan Vance Associates. Registered in the Caymans." He paused. There was a third party in those files. Someone who'd been sending Bradley money through that structure for 2 years. Then stopped. Then started sending something different. "Blackmail," Elena said. Roy looked at the steering wheel. "I'm not saying what it was. I'm saying the tone of the correspondence I saw for the 10 seconds it was on screen was not the tone of a business relationship." She had what she needed. The last stop was a law firm on East 53rd that she had researched carefully. Not a corporate firm, a litigation firm, the kind that took whistleblower cases, employment law, securities fraud. The kind that had, on its website, a photograph of its founding partner accepting a public interest award from the New York State Bar. She had no appointment. She had $42 in her account and a canvas tote full of reconstructed documents and a phone full of photographs. What she had was enough. She had learned that from her father, too. She left the package with the overnight service desk. The documents, organized and labeled, with a cover letter she had written in the Kinkos and printed before leaving. She included the fragment originals in separate sealed bags. She included her contact information. She included the name Bradley Vance, spelled out clearly, in the first line of the first paragraph. Then she stood on East 53rd at 4:30 in the morning, the city moving around her in its indifferent, perpetual way. And she looked up at the Apex Capitol building visible 3 blocks west. She thought about her father's hands on that gate in 1998. The specific patience of them. The absolute absence of fear. She thought about a $34,000 retirement account. A 67-year-old man whose name was on a notice he'd never received. Daniel Miller in a holding cell because he was young and in debt and someone needed a name to put on a ledger. She thought about $42.10. She reached into her jacket pocket and pressed her fingers around the union pin. The edge was still sharp. She had never been inside Arthur Winston's private office. She had cleaned the corridor outside it for 3 years, had emptied the bin his assistant left at the threshold on Tuesday and Friday nights, had once replaced the hallway light fixture that ran the length of the outer wall. With a maintenance worker who spent most of the job explaining to her how buildings worked. She knew the office by its perimeter. The particular quality of silence that accumulated outside a room where decisions were made that affected thousands of people. Now she was inside it. The room was what it was: large, correctly lit, the Manhattan skyline framed in floor-to-ceiling glass like a painting commissioned specifically for this view. Arthur Winston sat behind a desk that had probably cost more than her car. He was 62 years old, with the careful posture of a man who had maintained his appearance as a professional discipline, and he was looking at her stained janitor's uniform, her canvas tote bag, her worn work boots on his carpet with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not contempt, not quite shock, something more complicated than either. She had called in a favor to get here. Not her own favor, her father's. A union contact who had a security guard contact who had, after a long pause on the phone, agreed to make sure that Elena Rossi was on the service elevator at 7:45 a.m. and that the security log would show nothing unusual. The invisible infrastructure had held. She crossed the room without rushing and placed her father's union pin on the center of Arthur Winston's desk. He looked at it. The air in the room changed in a specific, identifiable way. Arthur Winston had last seen that pin in 1998, on the lapel of a man who had saved his life and asked nothing in return. "You're Frank's daughter," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. "I'm Frank's daughter," she said. "My name is Elena Rossi. I've been working the overnight cleaning shift on your 42nd floor for 3 years." A long pause. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." She set the canvas tote on the chair beside the desk. "Mr. Winston, I need you to listen to something." She pulled out her phone. She had the recording ready she'd cued it the night before, the specific segment she needed. She set the phone on the desk and pressed play. The voice was unmistakable. Bradley Vance, in his own register, speaking with the confident fluency of a man who believed himself entirely alone. She had obtained it through Roy, who had remembered after their conversation in the parking structure that the car service tablet's microphone had been active during one of the Connecticut trips. Who had gone back to check the cloud backup? Who had called her at 6 that morning to say, "You need to hear this"? The recording was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. In it, Bradley Vance discussed, with a calm specificity that was more damning than anger would have been, the mechanics of the ghost account network. He mentioned the junior analyst rotation. He mentioned the aggregate figure, not 4 million, not 50 million, the actual figure, which was considerably larger than either. He mentioned the Connecticut address and the arrangement with the party identified as KV. And he mentioned, with the particular casualness of someone discussing a minor administrative detail, that the current fall guy, the kid with the debt, Miller, had been perfectly positioned for exactly this purpose. "A man in debt is a man who needs the job," Bradley said on the recording. "A man who needs the job doesn't look too hard at what he's signing off on. And when it falls apart, the paperwork points to his credentials. It's elegant, really." Elena stopped the playback. Arthur Winston had not moved. The color had left his face in a way that wasn't gradual, it had departed all at once, like something switched off. He was looking at the phone on his desk as if it had become an object he didn't recognize. "Today," Elena said, "a judge is going to say out loud what I've been screaming in my heart for 3 years." She heard the steadiness in her own voice with a distant kind of surprise. "An innocent 28-year-old man is in custody right now for something that was designed around him. Your VP has been stripping retirement accounts from your clients for years. And he's been doing it using the infrastructure of this company as the mechanism." Arthur Winston reached out slowly and picked up the union pin. He held it the way people hold objects that are connected to old debts, with both gravity and care. "Frank saved my life," he said. "In 1998, 3 men, parking garage on Hudson Street. He stopped. He never told anyone. He never asked for anything." "I know," Elena said. "I built everything after that," he said. "The company. All of it." He was looking at the pin, not her. "I told myself I was doing it the right way. I told myself." "Mr. Winston." Her voice was not unkind. "The FBI is waiting outside." He looked up. "I didn't come here to litigate 1998, she said. "I came here because you are the only person in this building who can make the next 10 minutes happen correctly. Daniel Miller needs to be released. The accounts need to be frozen before Bradley moves the remaining funds. And you need to let the people outside that door in." A long silence. Arthur Winston set the union pin down. He looked at it for one more moment. Then he reached for his phone and pressed the intercom button. "Send them in," he said. The door opened. Bradley Vance was already in the corridor, summoned under the pretext of an emergency board call, still operating on the assumption that the morning was his. He came through the doorway with the specific confidence of a man who had spent years walking into rooms that adjusted to accommodate him. He stopped when he saw Elena. The confusion on his face was genuine, and she watched it move through its stages: recognition, then recalibration, then the first cold touch of understanding. He looked at her, at the phone on the desk, at Arthur Winston's expression. "What is," he started. "Bradley Vance?" The agent stepped into the room from the corridor, another at his shoulder, identification already out. "We need you to come with us." Bradley's face cycled through 4 more expressions in quick succession. Elena watched all of them. She watched the expensive suit wrinkle as he was turned, gently but without ambiguity, toward the door. She watched the cufflinks catch the light one final time. She watched the particular architecture of his certainty built over decades, reinforced by every room that had adjusted to accommodate him collapse like a structure whose load-bearing wall had been quietly removed while he wasn't watching. He looked back at her once, from the doorway. She held his gaze. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. Arthur Winston sat in the quiet of his office after the agents led Bradley out. The city moved in the windows. The union pin sat on his desk between them. He looked older, Elena thought. Not in the way of decay but in the way of reckoning the specific aging that comes from understanding something you'd been managing not to understand. "What do you need?" he asked her. She thought about the Medicare rejection notice. About Daniel's HELOC papers on the breakroom table. About a 67-year-old man whose retirement account had been redirected to a country club renovation. Daniel Miller's record cleared, she said. His debt covered not as charity, as restitution, from the restoration of whatever your legal team recovers. Done, he said, and every affected account holder made whole. Done. She picked up the union pin from his desk. She looked at it once. Then she set it back down, in front of him. "That belongs here," she said. It was always meant to remind someone of what they owe. She picked up her canvas tote. She walked out. The community center in New Jersey smelled like fresh paint and industrial coffee and the particular warmth of a room that had recently been full of people. It was a Tuesday in February, 3 months after the morning Elena Rossi had walked out of Arthur Winston's office with her canvas tote and her work boots. And the specific lightness of someone who has set down something very heavy. The center was in the building that had once housed a union hall, her father's, though the lettering above the door had been repainted twice since then. And most of the people who passed it no longer knew its history. She knew. She had signed the lease 6 weeks ago. The signature had taken longer than it should have, not from hesitation, but from something closer to the feeling of completing a sentence that had been interrupted 15 years earlier. Her hand had moved across the line and produced the name she'd been hiding, fully and without abbreviation: Elena M. Rossi, and it had felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something that actually fit. The Rossi Legal Aid Fund occupied the center's east wing, 2 rooms. A waiting area with chairs that didn't match. A bulletin board already accumulating the kind of layered paper that meant people were using it. The fund provided free legal consultation for essential workers navigating exactly the kind of situation Elena had spent 3 years watching accumulate on the 42nd floor. Wage theft cases, wrongful termination, retirement account disputes, benefits denials. The kind of cases that were winnable, often, but only if someone knew what to do and could afford to find out. The settlement from Apex Capital had not been what Arthur Winston called hush money, because Elena had made clear, with the lawyers the fund had retained, that a confidentiality clause was not something she was willing to sign. The funds were categorized as restoration, a word she had chosen specifically, and which the legal team had eventually accepted. Restoration meant the money went toward something, not into an account, into this. She was at the filing table in the back room when Daniel knocked on the doorframe. He had been here every Tuesday for 6 weeks, which she had not asked him to be but had not discouraged either. He'd lost weight in the months since his arrest and then regained some of it. And there was a quality to him now that hadn't been there before, not harder, exactly, but more careful. More attentive. The kind of person who checks his assumptions twice. The NWIN files are organized, he said, setting a manila folder on the table. And the Carver intake is done. She's coming back Thursday. Good, Elena said. Thank you. He sat in the chair across from her. He'd stopped apologizing for the chair without being asked to stop. It had just gradually dropped from the beginning of his sentences. The way unnecessary things do when people spend enough time together. Arthur Winston called the fund this morning, he said. She kept her eyes on the file in front of her. I know. I got the message. He wants to expand the board. Add 2 more directors. Tell him I'll think about it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. You're not going to let him make this easy, are you? He can make it right, she said. That's different. He nodded. He understood the distinction. She could see that he did. She drove to Newark in the early afternoon. Her father's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like cooking and old carpet. The particular combination of a place where people actually lived. She knocked twice her knock, the one she'd always used, and heard his voice from inside, a little distant, the television on. He was in his recliner. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle that made the room look warmer than it was. The medication covered now, the Medicare supplement finally processed, the gap funding from the Restoration Fund covering the previous month's shortfall. Had been working for 6 weeks. The neurologist had used the word stabilized with the specific measured caution of someone who had learned not to promise more than the evidence supported. But stabilized was a word Elena had been holding in her chest like a stone. She was afraid to examine, and on the days it felt solid, it felt very solid indeed. Her father looked at her when she came through the door. He looked at her, not at the doorframe or the middle distance or some interior landscape she couldn't reach at her. His eyes cleared in that particular way they sometimes did, the fog pulling back like a curtain moving in a draft, and for a moment Frank Rossi was simply Frank Rossi. Sitting in his chair on a Tuesday afternoon, watching his daughter come through the door. Elena, he said, her name, in his voice, in that register. No uncertainty in it. She sat on the footstool beside his chair, the one she'd been sitting on since she was small enough for it to feel large. She took his hand, the hand that had passed ledger pages through gate bars in 1998, that had built something durable. Out of principle and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to accept that the strong should simply devour the vulnerable. "Hi, Dad," she said. He patted her hand, settled back. The television murmured. She sat there for a long time, not talking. There was nothing that needed to be said right now that couldn't be said better by simply being present. She was learning that the particular value of presence as its own complete statement, not a preamble to something else. She was back at the center by 6. The evening intake was just beginning. A couple, both in their 60s, a landlord dispute that had been spiraling for months. She took their folder from the intake stack, reviewed the basics while the coffee finished brewing, and went to greet them in the waiting room. On her way through the hall, she passed the small framed photograph she'd hung near the entrance 3 weeks ago. It was from 1997, the one from her kitchen, her father and 3 other union men outside the construction site gate. Grinning with the satisfaction of something won. She'd had it reprinted slightly larger, the colors a little clearer. She paused. She thought about a supply closet on the 42nd floor, a Medicare rejection notice, a crumpled document in a leather wastebasket, the rhythmic sound of a vacuum cleaner at 3 in the morning, filling corridors full of people who would never know her name. At 45, she thought, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. She had believed, for a long time, that the act of hiding was a kind of survival. That reducing yourself to something that couldn't be targeted was the same thing as being safe. And perhaps, for a period, it had been necessary. She didn't dispute that. She had learned things in those years that she couldn't have learned any other way. About how buildings worked from the inside, about what people revealed when they forgot they were being observed, about the specific, underestimated power of paying attention. But you could not spend a life in the supply closet. Eventually, the closet was just a closet. She straightened the frame slightly, walked on. The couple in the waiting room was nervous in the way people are nervous when they've been fighting alone for a long time. And are only now, tentatively, considering that they don't have to. Elena sat down across from them and opened the folder and asked the first question. She used her own name when she introduced herself. Elena Rossi. It felt, as it had every time for 3 months now, exactly like what it was hers. Not inherited in the way of a burden. Claimed the way you claim something you've earned back. The way you sign a lease with a hand that doesn't shake, in letters that are firm and clear and take up their proper amount of space on the page. Outside, the February evening was doing what February evenings did, cold and honest and utterly indifferent to what any single person had managed or survived. The city ran on in its perpetual register of money and momentum and 10,000 private reckonings, happening simultaneously in apartments and offices and car service vehicles and supply closets. She opened her notepad. She uncapped her pen. She began. Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with Elena's journey since the moment she found that crumpled notice in Bradley Vance's trash bin. A woman who had made herself invisible to survive, who had traded her name and her history for the safety of anonymity, and who discovered, in the coldest hour of her life, that invisibility is not the same thing as protection. That some men will step on you regardless of how small you make yourself. That the floor you're mopping is still a floor whether you believe you belong on it or not. What Elena understood, finally what her father had always known, is that knowledge has a different weight than power. Power can be stripped, a title, a job, a name, these things can be taken. But what you know, what you've quietly gathered while no one thought to look at you, that stays yours. 3 years of watching, 3 years of collecting what others threw away. And in the end, it was the janitor who balanced the ledger. I think about Daniel Miller in that story, 28 years old, working late under fluorescent lights, trying to calculate a way out of a number that kept growing. And I think about how close he came to losing everything because one man decided his debt made him useful as a scapegoat. It's a reminder that the people most vulnerable to exploitation are often the ones working hardest to do right. That a system designed to bury the truth depends on the rest of us not paying attention. Elena paid attention. For 3 years, in the dark, at 3 in the morning, she paid attention. And when the moment came, she walked into that room in a stained janitor's uniform and changed the outcome. There's something in that for all of us. It's never too late to stop hiding. It's never too late to pick up the pen and sign your own name. The ledger isn't closed until you close it. I hope this story brought you something you needed today. If it moved you, if Elena's quiet courage spoke to something in your own life, please let me know in the comments. Share it with someone who's fighting something right now. They might need to hear it. And please subscribe and hit that like button. It's the best way to make sure stories like Elena's find the people who need them most. Until next time, friends, take care of yourselves and each other.